In this video, I'm going to show you how to factor trinomials using the X method. Now, the X method really means we're just going to rewrite these trinomials to use factor by grouping. And for reference, we're going to think of all our trinomials in this form of ax squared plus bx plus c. In other words, a is the number in front of the squared term, b is the number in front of the x term, and c is the number all by itself. So in this example, a would be 6, b would be negative 11, and c would be 4. Okay, so let's factor using the X method. So at the top of the X, I'm always going to write a times c. And at the bottom of the X, I'm going to write the b term all by itself. So in this problem, a times c is 6 times 4, which is 24. And the b term is negative 11. So I want two numbers that multiply to be 24, but add to be negative 11. Well, that's going to be 3 and 8. And they're both going to need to be negative because they're going to multiply to positive 24, but add to negative 11. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to rewrite now. The first term stays the same, but the middle term, we're going to rewrite it using these two terms we just found over here. So instead of negative 11y, I'm going to write negative 3y minus 8y. Which is negative 11y if I just combine the two terms together. Now, the whole point of that is now we can factor by grouping. So out of the first group, I can factor out a 3y. So I would be left with 2y, and then because I'm dividing 3y by 3y, I'm left with a 1. Out of the second group, I see that they have a 4 in common. But whenever that leading term is negative, I'm always going to factor out the negative number. So that's going to leave me with 2y minus 1. Okay, so these two parenthesis terms, which I like to refer to as the blobs, match. And the two numbers out in front of the blobs, those two numbers are going to go in the second parenthesis, including the sign. And that is the factored form, which we could check by multiplying. So let's try another example. This time, let's say A in this problem is going to be 1, B is going to be negative 2, and C is negative 48. And A is 1 because when we don't see the number in front, we assume it's a 1. All right, so at the top of the X is A times C, or 1 times negative 48, which is just negative 48. The bottom of the X is the B term, which is negative 2. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be negative 48, but add to be negative 2. Well, that's going to be negative 8 and 6. One needs to be negative so that they multiply to be a negative number. And I need the bigger number to be negative so that when they add, I'm left with a negative number. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this. First term stays the same. The middle term, instead of negative 2x, I'm going to use these two numbers here and write it as negative 8x plus 6x because it's positive. And then I'm going to bring down the last term, negative 48. Okay, I've got 4 terms, so now I can factor by grouping. So out of the first group, I can only factor out x, and I'm left with x minus 8. Second group, I can factor out a 6. And because the number in front of that is a positive, I'm going to factor out positive 6. And I'm left with x minus 8. So there's my blobs, x minus 8. And the numbers in front of the blobs, x and the plus 6, go in the other parenthesis. And there we go. All right, let's try this one. This one has a little bit bigger numbers. So a in this is going to be, oops, I'm going to switch that to my red pen. So A in this is going to be 25, B is negative 20, and C is 4. So at the top of the X, we're going to multiply A times C, which would be 100, and write the B term at the bottom. So two numbers that multiply to be the top number, 100, and add to be negative 20. That would be negative 10 and negative 10. All right, so I'm going to rewrite this as negative 25m squared And now I'm going to use this negative 10m minus 10m plus 4. So I bring down the last term. All right, so factoring by grouping, I can pull out a 5m from the first group, and I'm left with 5m minus 2. From the second group, I could pull out a 2, and I can pull out a negative 2 at that. So that'll leave me with 5m minus 2. So there's our blob, 5m minus 2. And in front, we have a 5m minus 2. So it repeated itself. It's the same factor. So if we want to be cute, we can write it as 5m minus 2 squared. They have a name for this. This is called a perfect square trinomial. So that's a trinomial that when we factor it, ends up coming out to a perfect square like this, or the same factor twice. By the way, I could have noticed that when I look back up here at the x and I see that I used the same number twice. That's the hint. Whenever we use the same number twice, it's going to end up being a perfect square trinomial like this. Okay, now this last example, I'm actually, before I write, my A and my C and B, I'm going to notice that I can factor out a GCF right from the beginning. I see that 5 goes into all 3 of these numbers. So I'm going to factor that out first. So I'm going to be left with a squared plus 11a plus 10. Okay, now for right now, I'm going to ignore the 5, and I'm going to go ahead and list the numbers in front of the variables. So in front of the a squared is now a 1. I'm looking just inside the parentheses too. I'm ignoring the 5. In front of the a, I have an 11. And the last term, the constant, is a 10. All right, so at the top of the x, we will have 1 times 10, which is 10. At the bottom of the x, we have 11. 2 numbers that multiply to be 10 but add to be 11, 10 and 1. And both are positive because everything's positive. Okay, so I'm ignoring the 5 right now, and I'm going to rewrite a squared. Instead of 11a, I'm going to write it as 10a plus 1a plus 10. Okay, now I'm going to factor by grouping. So out of the first group, I can factor out an a, and I'd be left with a plus 10. Can't factor anything out of the second group, though. So when that happens, we can always factor out a 1. The number in front, by the way, is a positive, so I'm going to think of it as a positive 1, and I'd be left with a plus 10. So there it is. My blobs match. I have a plus 10. The numbers in front are an a plus 1, and I don't want to forget my GCF of 5, which I'll write out in the very front. And that is how we factor by grouping.